Don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. This episode is another in the Salon-style conversations that I've been having and publishing in recent months. I really enjoy having these good faith conversations with folks who may have some disagreements or interesting questions about some of the things that we think about with teaching and learning and the importance of those things. And this one was no different. This conversation focused on the intersections of science of learning, project-based learning, and inquiry. And I was joined by Andrew Watson, Dr. Cindy Nebel, and Fox Demoisey. More about them in a moment, but this conversation came about as Andrew had messaged me asking about a research study that he actually thought I had recommended to him, and I may have, I just don't remember if I did. But he was asking about that because he was writing a blog piece which he published that is titled Still Doubting My Doubts, the Case of PBL. After he published that, I reached out to him and asked him if he might be interested in coming on the podcast, and we started talking about other voices that might be interesting on that topic as well. And I thank Andrew, Cindy, and Fox for joining me on what I think was a great conversation. Andrew Watson is the founder and president of Translate the Brain, where he offers professional development presentations and workshops that explore and explain the practical teaching implications of today's brain sciences. He's authored several books on teaching and learning that look to apply cognitive science and what might be called the science of learning. Dr. Cindy Nebel is the Director of Learning Services at St. Louis University School of Medicine and an active collaborator of the Learning Scientists, an organization that tries to make scientific research on learning more accessible to students, teachers, and other educators. She's published numerous books and journal articles applying the science of learning to educational and organizational contexts, and has presented the science of learning nationally and internationally, and is dedicated to bridging research practice to improve educational and organizational outcomes. Fox Demoisey, other than being a former colleague and academic coach who worked with me when I was teaching and in the classroom, has been a professional learning coordinator in the Office of Teaching and Learning since joining the Kentucky Department of Education in February of 2022. Prior to that, he was an instructional coach for Shelby County Public Schools in Shelbyville, Kentucky for 10 years and taught high school ELA in Colorado, California, and of course, Kentucky. Recent work with KDE, most relevant to this discussion, includes producing guidance to support districts in leveraging findings from learning science to integrate deeper learning into use of high-quality instructional materials. Relevant earlier work includes providing training within a local district around implementing project-based learning, as well as coaching to educators in the design and facilitation of PBL projects. And full disclosure, Fox is a friend of mine, and as I said, when I was in the classroom, I asked him to partner with me as an academic coach to improve my teaching. As always, I encourage you to visit our website, which is wegrowteachers.com, for all of our professional learning, including project-based learning. And in that vein, we are in the midst of registration for PBL Grow 25, our summer conference, which is held here in Louisville, Kentucky, June 23rd through 25th. You can find that information as well as all of our workshops, professional learning, and services at wegrowteachers.com. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or ideas, feel free to reach out to me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. And now, without further ado, here is our conversation, which might feel like you're joining after we had started, but I was explaining how we were going to get going, and Andrew just took the ball and ran with it, so there we went. The idea, I think, was Andrew and I were kind of going back and forth about PBL. I'm obviously an advocate. And I think, Cindy, maybe you're a little bit more skeptical, sort of trying to bridge some of those gaps between science of learning and project-based learning and that kind of thing. So I think I'll just sort of welcome everybody to the conversation. And maybe, Andrew, if you want to start kind of with maybe a recap of the blog piece that you wrote, the Still Doubting My Doubt, which is maybe a good place to start. I don't really want to be leading this conversation per se, as much more of a Salon idea. And if you have questions, please ask them of each other, and more of a discussion than me saying, here's a question. I might do that though. So does that sound reasonable?
Well, you asked me to speak, so it sounds very reasonable to me. Anytime I get the microphone right at the beginning, I feel like we're off to a good start. Yes, I wrote a blog post a little while ago, and maybe I should back up a bit. Almost by accident, one of my sub-specialties, sub-interests in this field is tracking down quote-unquote research-based claims. So when someone goes to a teacher and says, "Oh, teacher, you really should do this thing because research says you should do the thing," I try to jump in and say, okay, before we do that, can you tell me more about this research? And I want to look at it and be sure that I'm persuaded by that. And for me, that comes out of a concern, having been myself a classroom teacher for so long. I get a little protective of teachers when people try and use research. I'm going to use some strong words to boss teachers around and say that, you're really failing to do your job if you don't do what I tell you to do. I feel protective and say, well, no, you don't get to say that to teachers until we have a chance to look at this research that you're championing. So on the blog that I write for Learning the Brain, occasionally I'll write a piece where I look at some research-based advice and look at the research behind it and explore whether or not I think the research supports that claim. And in particular, it's obviously important that I be extra aware of my own position in that if I go in, so for instance, I'm a summer camp guy. So whenever I see research that says spending time outdoors is good for learning, I'm incredibly biased in favor of research that says that, which means I have to be extra rigorous in trying to find the weaknesses in the research that supports that claim. So in this case, for cognitive science working memory reasons that it maybe I'll go into later, or Cindy will have something to say about later, I sometimes worry that PBL gets over championed or exaggerated or applied in a blunt way. So I come in with worries about sort of a universal PBL insistence. So I honestly can't remember who it was. Drew, I thought it was you, in fact, who had said, oh, well, you should, if you're a skeptic, you should really look at this research. So I looked at it, and to my surprise, it held up better than I thought it might. So for instance, the control group was pretty good. It wasn't great, but it was pretty good. Which is to say the teachers in both the PBL group and the control group, they both got extra PD. The students in the control group didn't get extra, which would have been better, but at least the teachers got something extra. And the measurement that they used felt reasonable to me. Maybe not the best ever, but the sorts of stumbles that I usually run into when I look at research weren't there. And what it found is the students in the PBL group, I think the effect size was 0.227 or something like that, which isn't enormous, but isn't nothing. And to be more specific, if I am right that one of the great dangers of badly done PBL is working memory overload, well, if the students experienced a lot of working memory overload, they would not have done better. They would have done noticeably worse. So I think at a minimum, we can look at that study and say, this study does not support my concern that PBL will overload working memory. And that was an interesting thing for me to see. And so I wrote a blog post about it.
Okay, great. And maybe it's helpful before we kind of get into the sort of meat of the dialogue, I guess, to have Cindy. I'm kind of curious of your perspective. You're working in the medical field, which some people at least say that PBL, problem-based learning, probably more than project-based learning, kind of came from the medical field. I'm not sure if that's exactly right or true, but it sounds good, and people say it, just like they say lots of things in education. So maybe Cindy, kind of talk about how you think about project-based learning and maybe some of the research, and then we can kind of go to Fox and then kind of open it up from there.
Yeah, so I think you're probably right. I don't think problem-based learning came from the medical field. Maybe the medical field made it really popular. I can maybe argue that people got excited about it over here. So, I spend most of my days working one-on-one with students, and my goal is to get them to learn and pass these very problem-based exams, right? Like they're very, very applied exams. And so, if we dig into the research, I certainly know all of the research that Andrew's talking about with working memory overload and problem-based learning. I certainly know a lot of the research looking at problem-based learning and showing good outcomes and others showing not great outcomes, right? So it's all out there. I think my sort of positionality coming into this conversation is probably maybe a bit skeptic. I would probably closer to that alignment, but knowing that I see day to day these students that come in and we have this interaction with their own background knowledge and expertise, right? And a lot of the time that we spend with these students involves like trying to get them up to speed so that they can do the application. But the application is so critical to all of the work that we're doing here that happens fairly rapidly in this environment. So I think I'm coming with a bit of a nuanced perspective here in seeing the value, the very high value of problem-based learning, because that's the world that I live in every day, but also seeing that the limitations on working memory and what you might need to make that most effective isn't always like dive right in, right? So I think that's kind of the direction that I'm coming from. And of course, we can go more into that and all the nuance, I think, here in a little bit. But Fox, you want to talk to us a little bit about your positionality, I suppose?
Well, before you do that, I would note that I was called a menace for the nuance that I try to introduce on social media. So just be careful with that.
I'm so sorry. I might be a menace. We'll see.
Watch out for signs of pending menace. I guess like thinking about the promise and the potential peril of PBL, both from the side of the state agency side and work with local curriculum and professional learning there, and then the side, sort of praxis of being in districts and buildings and doing that work with classroom teachers. In the work I'm doing with the Department of Education, the difficulty. So from some of the research we use in our rationale for high quality instructional materials, recognizing just the tremendous complexity and difficulty of even designing an on grade level standards aligned assignment, let alone if you think about scaling that complexity out to an entire unit and then layering deeper learning and that additional complexity on top of it. The difficulty of doing that well is fairly enormous, and the cost of not doing it well, I mean, we see it in the data and the research, but also experiencing that within districts and buildings. Yes, so on the state agency side, I guess the possibility of having a strong instructional material as sort of a foundation for the local curriculum, and then from that baseline, layering in elements of project-based learning and deeper learning on top of that with that strong curricular foundation is one of the things we're advocating at the state level in terms of classroom work with teachers, really trying to figure out when they're having to shoulder the burden, either collectively in PLCs or individually, of that design work, trying to figure out how do we design in such a way that we really have the intended academic learning engineered in, so that as we're doing sort of the grooviness of the project, we're not losing track of those academic outcomes and really what should be happening for kiddos vis-a-vis maybe our academic standards or whatever those outcomes might be. How do we engineer those in so they don't get lost, as sometimes happens when we're trying to do a project? And the difficulty of doing that, even when you are really systematic about trying to make sure that learning is engineered in a way that it doesn't leak out too badly, the difficulty of doing that with individual teachers, let alone trying to have that scale across a building or a district.
Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, I'm just curious, Fox. You described, oh dear, I'm going to use the word nuance, aren't I? A model of PBL where it starts with, dare I call this direct instruction of sort of getting a baseline of content, and then I think you used the phrase layering on or something like that, that the PBL comes relatively later in the process of building a mental model. And you talked about the difficulty of ensuring that people understand that that is an extended process of starting here and moving there and being sure that they're doing it. Is it your sense, because you're much more in this world than I am, that that is a typical understanding of what PBL ought to be, or is yours a somewhat unusual, or sort of where does that model of PBL fit in the broader spectrum of understanding of what PBL ideally looks like?
That's a great question. Two things. So, and I'm more familiar with one of the primary PBL providers than maybe some of the others, but have had occasion to sample across a little bit. So what you're describing is part of the trainings provided in the published materials, that mastery of academic content and making sure those things are there. It seems like as those trainings go from what's intended and what's published to what's sort of received and put into practice, sometimes the systems aren't in place to make sure that that intent sticks. So what's put out versus what ends up being the case and districts, buildings, and classrooms, oftentimes I think that's where some of the issue lies. And even when you sort of get at the difficulty of that transfer, if you are having to do that design work and actually being able, perhaps with your PLC, to engineer that, it's really complex work. The one thing I would, so in the instructional resources, the instructional materials that are doing deeper learning, I think all of them have some elements of it. Those that are more wired that way, that are also sort of rated as high quality, it's not always necessarily the building of background knowledge, that declarative and procedural before those elements of inquiry and authenticity. There's often an oscillation where you're doing some things to sort of prime interest, and then you're layering it and you're in develop some need for more information and skill, and then you provide some of that with explicit instruction, practice, and feedback, and then you prime it a little bit more. And so there's sort of, those things are there, but it's more in a layered and sort of incremental approach versus being like one and then the other necessarily.
Well, I think that kind of speaks, Andrew, your question kind of speaks to one of the things that it seems like there are at least two things to really think deeply about here. One is the research and the evidence, but then also putting it into practice. And to that point, I think it seems like there are different versions of PBL, right? And Cindy, you said problem-based learning. I say project-based learning. I differentiate that with an authentic audience, but that not everybody does. There are different ways that people think about and operationalize and define PBL, quote unquote PBL. And of course, then you get into the no true Scotsman fallacy, and then the tribalism comes out, and it's like, well, okay, there we go. What strikes me as a sort of an interesting question, because you're talking about working memory, is the importance of all the things that have been mentioned here, of the structure and the standards and the content, the academic outcomes, right? And to me, it really is one of the big questions is, what are the desired academic outcomes? Because while I'm really quite sympathetic to and advocate for explicit instruction and, cognitive load theory, I've had those kinds of discussions. There's much more to learning than just that I think most of us would agree to, even, the folks in the science learning movement per se. So, those scaffolding pieces, I think, should and must be inside of a project-based learning experience or unit. But the rub to me sort of comes like, okay, we do the building of background knowledge, and then we do the project. And to me, there's an opportunity cost. There's a missed opportunity there of having a really strong driving question and giving students the opportunity and the teachers the opportunity to model, what do we need to know? What are the questions we need to consider? What do we need to learn in order to answer that driving question, which of course those things should be aligned with the content standards, the academic outcomes, and explicit instruction, assessment, all those kinds of things. So to me, if I say I want my students to develop that skill, that takes lots of practice and modeling, not doing project-based learning the way that I envision it loses that opportunity. So I'm curious anybody's, sort of thoughts on that.
Drew, I completely agree that the fundamental question here, it's not which is better or what order should we do things in, so much as it is when we should do what, and what our dependent variable is. Like, what are we really interested in? Fox, you mentioned some things about motivation here, right? And so there's a potential that is not necessarily the dependent variable of interest in most science of learning research, that is this going to motivate students to be more engaged in the work that we're doing in the classroom? And that in and of itself could lead to additional learning. But when we try to do really rigorous research, we have to isolate these variables. And so as we do that, and we try to strip things down as much as we can, we might lose some of the effects of potentially motivation and curiosity, and even that skill building, that what you're describing, Drew, as this sort of like inquiry-based critical thinking way of approaching the world, that would be a very long-term effect, right? We wouldn't be looking at that on the end of semester grades. That would be something that we would expect that would impact students later in life. I mean, right. And so trying to do that kind of research gets messier and messier and messier. And I don't know that that research has been done, right? In order to say definitively one way or another what the impact is of PBL on those things. Does that ring true for you too, Andrew?
Oh gosh, yes. For perfectly good financial and systemic reasons, research operates within a fairly short time frame typically. One of the things that I really liked about this study that I started by summarizing was that I think they measured it over the course of the academic year, which is an enormously long amount of time in your average study. Many studies are done, Cindy, you know this world better than I, but in a small number of hours, 2 or 3 or 4 is a perfectly typical way of measuring things. And learning, I'm guessing all of us as teachers would agree that learning doesn't really happen on the number of hours scale. It happens on the number of months scale or the number of years scale. So it's really easy to miss the bigger questions and topics that we all as teachers and educators are most deeply interested in.
Yeah, and that research piece, Cindy, I think your point is spot on. And I've had these conversations, with Dylan William and Carl Hendrick, and science learning folks will be very familiar with all those names. It is hard. Like, I advocate for inquiry for more reasons than I articulated there, but certainly the one that I articulated, I think, is academically probably the most important. But there isn't research, and nobody's done research that I know of, because it would be such a long tail kind of thing. Like, it seems intuitively true, and I've said this in multiple conversations, intuitively true, that if you don't practice and model that kind of inquiry mindset over years, or let me say it this way, if you do, then it will very likely crystallize as more knowledge and more wisdom and experiences come on board in the brain and developmentally. And so, to me, even if we don't have that research, and I think this is a sort of critique of the sort of science of learning movement, as I think about it, is such a narrow focus on immediate results and things that are quantifiable very, very, very soon, right? I saw a quote the other day, we can't, we can't quantify it, we can't measure it. And I thought, that doesn't seem to be true at all. We could certainly measure evidence of things, and might not be exactly a math problem quantifiable, but that to me is a real limitation of the science of learning sort of movement, as it were, because it does seem to me to be really, really narrow, and sort of just throws out, just excludes and says, dismisses, and honestly, I think sometimes denigrates the idea of anything inquiry, anything in that sort of end of the spectrum because, well, there's no evidence for it, and therefore we must focus on these certain kinds of things.
Yeah, I would argue that what that really means is that we need to seek evidence, right? That
Yeah.
if we don't have definitive evidence either way for those types of things, then we should be looking for that. At the same time, I think there is value in knowing the sort of basic mechanisms that come out of the science of learning research, right? Because even if we are looking at those long-term results, those sort of like, or some of the different like soft skill kind of things, soft skill is probably the wrong word for that, but you know what I'm trying to say there,
right?
That might come out of that kind of structure. We still have to make sure that we are honoring what we do know, right? That if we do know that cognitive load could be an issue, we need to make sure that we are monitoring that. Now, what you guys described is even this sort of like oscillation of let's define some curiosity first, and then let's give you what you need, right? Like give you the direct instruction for that, and then let's ask some more questions about it, and then give you what you need. I feel like what you're describing there is honoring that, right? That you are providing the direct instruction when it is needed.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that we always have fidelity of implementation, as you were saying, Fox, right? Like that.
I'm sure that we don't.
Yeah. In ideal circumstances, that makes sense. But, you know, also in ideal circumstances, a lot of the science of learning stuff makes sense. And then you put it in the wild and it doesn't work out quite the same way.
I wonder if this thought holds together. So thinking about the outcomes that are often a part of a deeper learning or PBL design, whether it's, again, something that's in a published material or something that teachers are trying to do. And those outcomes are often academic, aligned to standards. The durable or soft skills that you mentioned, like some combination of those, often there's social emotional competencies brought in there as well. And in our work with districts, I mean, we emphasize, yes, those things have a place. Yes, there can be a complementary fit, and you can strategically have those things sort of braided into a unit or module. The complexity of doing that is kind of significant. But whatever you're doing, any capacity you hope to grow with your students, you have to have explicit instruction with modeling. There has to be guided strategic practice, and there has to be feedback. If we want students to get better at any particular thing, the more you layer into a unit, the more strategic you have to be to allow for that movement back and forth of those things, so as not to overload the bandwidth of your kiddos. The complexity of really doing that, there are resources that do that well. There are individual teachers and teams of teachers that are able to sort of design that way. It's just really difficult to do at scale.
I want to ask, I'm not sure how to describe this question. We'll see where it goes. Maybe one way to think about the debate that we're having is we have teaching method A, which is relatively likely to be successful at helping students learn relatively basic things. And we have method of teaching B, which is much harder to accomplish. If it doesn't succeed, the result will be that they learn less than method A. And if it does succeed, the result will be that they learn more than method A. And there's a practical calculus in thinking through that. There's almost a moral calculus in thinking through that. If method B is better and so hard to execute well that most teachers really struggle to learn how to do it well, parsing through that calculus of advocating for something which is great if it works, but might not work. How do we think through that challenge together?
So does it help? Because this is the way that I talk about it often in our PBL workshops and inquiry workshops as well. And I think it's important to distinguish between those two, and also note that inquiry is not an either or. It's sort of, maybe a dimmer switch is a way to think about it, right? You can have limited inquiry, you can have full-on discovery learning, and there's lots of room in between there, right? And in project-based learning, the way that I think about it, and the way that I work with teachers on it, is that it should have inquiry, it should have explicit instruction, it should have collaboration, all of those kinds of things. But I like the framework that John Hattie uses of teaching with intent. And so, surface deep and transfer learning, and thinking, all right, again, back to those academic outcomes, what do we want from this learning experience, whether it's a PBL unit, whether it's a lesson, whatever, and that all of your decisions should be dictated by what your desired academic outcomes are. And so if you really just want to build background knowledge or build knowledge, then I say explicit instruction is obviously the most efficient. Maybe not necessarily most effective, but in most cases the most effective, because efficient is pretty synonymous with effective. But if you want to get to the deep and perhaps transfer, although I think it's more deep learning, that you've got to engage the students and the learners in some sort of inquiry kind of process. And again, that can look a lot of different ways. It's a slippery term, which is a part of why this is such a difficult thing. You can say this is explicit instruction, this is direct instruction, this is capital DI, direct instruction. Inquiry is a sort of spectrum. And so to me, that sort of teaching with intent, and I think there are different ways to phrase that, but teaching with intent that Hattie talks about, I think really does help in that term, in that sense, Andrew, of like, what are we trying to accomplish here? And then what are the right tools to get us there? And to me, that makes sense. And I'm curious, does that make sense to you?
Drew, I want to sort of like challenge something that you said there. And it's not necessarily saying that I haven't fully fleshed out this thought.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was literally working on some slides right before we started this about how to develop expertise for transfer, right? That's what I'm literally talking about. And much of what I'm talking about is the critical importance of rich foundational background knowledge if we want to accomplish transfer. So this is like Willingham talks really, really well about how knowledge helps, right? So if and maybe it's a both and situation here. It's not a one or the other. But if we know that, explicit instruction or direct instruction, and I'm going to use them interchangeably, you know what I'm talking about, is the most effective or efficient for developing that rich background knowledge, and that is critical for transfer, then does my question make sense here? Is like, then where does PBL fit into that if we know that is true?
PBL or inquiry?
Inquiry. Well, inquiry. Sorry. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Because to me, PBL should include explicit and instruction and all those kinds of things. Well, yeah. So I think that inquiry, like my reading of Hattie is that and that's why I said deep learning, as he talks about it. I think inquiry is much more important. But that in that transfer learning stage, that explicit instruction is perhaps more relevant. I think it's, like you said, sort of a both and. But yeah, to me, inquiry is how you sort of connect the dots and get more big picture thinking. And it's so like I would say. And sometimes I do say, all right, if I was when I taught government, for example, I might teach the idea of federalism. So the knowledge of the three branches of government, separation of powers, three levels, blah, 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 right? Knowing that's important, but then asking a question, for example, of, does the executive branch in the United States have too much power at this point? Well, some of the things you might need to know are some of the things I just talked about. And there might be different answers to that question, right? So you're getting into the deeper learning kinds of things. You're applying it to different kinds of questions. The transfer piece to me, might say, does the executive branch in North Korea have too much power? Now you need some more knowledge because you don't know what their system is like. You are then taking what you know and sort of overlaying it and comparing, contrasting. So there's a sort of both and, right, nuance.
I don't actually disagree with you at all. As you were talking, I was like, except that's exactly what I argue also is that when we're thinking about even, application and transfer to new things, it's one thing to have that background knowledge, but you also need to have that deep knowledge. And the strategies I talk about are essentially inquiry strategies, right? Elaborative interrogation of asking good how and why questions. That's inquiry, right?
Yeah. And I think Fox has something he wants to say here, but my contention is that those folks who are really, the sharpest tools in the science of learning shed, as it were, do lots of inquiry. But there's a sort of tribalistic urge to say that inquiry is bad by the ones who are more tribalistic. So, Fox?
Were you reading the face that I had something to say?
Yeah.
Just circling back very directly to Andrew's question, which is a great one, and some research that we were doing within the office around helping districts integrate local curriculum with deeper learning and PBL where that's in play. And you're absolutely right. The success rate of PBL is not super high when that design burden is left on teams of teachers or teachers, and the cost of that, especially to already disadvantaged learners, of PBL not done well, is high. As we looked into some of the research, we found essentially of all the research on PBL and sifting through all of that, there were 3 studies where academic outcomes improved at scale for all learners. And what we noticed was in all 3 of those studies, as we got into the study conditions, all of them had the projects that were used in the curriculum designed by outside experts. And then all of the teachers received curriculum-specific professional learning to help them use those projects effectively and build the related pedagogy. When that safety net was put in place at scale, kids grew at scale. And so we actually reached out to the lead researcher of one of the prominent PBL organizations, just said, and she was nice enough to speak with us, this is what we're finding. Is that accurate? And she just enthusiastically nodded and said, absolutely. Where PBL works well at scale and doesn't leave kiddos behind is where there is support in that high quality design being provided and the associated professional learning. In fact, that's so much the case, we're now moving into that space ourselves of providing high quality, well-designed PBL that's going to bring all of those pieces together effectively. And the training teachers need to be able to support all of their kiddos. So yeah, you're right. Just sort of providing that training and releasing teachers to sort of try to make the best of it. It's oftentimes frustrating for students and teachers. And again, now I'm speaking from the side of having been in those spaces where teachers are really enthusiastic coming out of the training, and then the difficulty of that design and facilitation work and the experience of their students just becomes disheartening. Not all the time, but often.
So that makes me nervous too, in an equity lens, right? So because you're right that the kiddos who are going to be differentially impacted by bad, we'll just say inquiry is like the catch-all term here, but by bad inquiry-based practices are going to be the ones that are already disadvantaged. And what you just described, Fox, sounds expensive. It sounds expensive for a district or for a school or for whoever, both in terms of time and money. So in order to do it well, are we still in like a rich get richer kind of place here, that the only people who are going to be able to do it well are the people who are already economically advantaged? And so we're going to continue to, that worries me.
Yeah, and it worries me. I mean, we're a PBL provider, and I always advocate for starting small for at least that reason, because if you get a 6-week project and it's a train wreck, then it can be disastrous. And while I am an advocate for PBL and inquiry at large, I think if you're going to err on one side or the other, I would say err on knowledge building and making sure that kids know things. But maybe this question is helpful or is interesting as a sort of add-on to what we've talked about. We talked about transfer, and research shows that like inquiry or those skills are the transfer of them is domain specific, right? That people will say, Paul Kirshner will always say, you can't transfer skills outside of domain effectively. But I wonder, kind of getting back to some of the early things, and it's my conjecture is that sort of the inquiry mindset, the sort of approach that I advocate for that might crystallize, and I hopefully does crystallize. We don't have any research yet. Happy to do the research if somebody wants to fund it. But that is something that is transferable and super, super important for a couple of reasons. One, because as adults, we're going to encounter things in life for which there are no teachers around to give us the knowledge. So we need to be able to figure out what are the questions I should be really thinking through in order to solve this problem, right? Life problems, medical problems. I was helping my mom recover from a pretty bad injury, trying to navigate the healthcare system and nurse, doctor instructions. What are the questions that can help us do that in a way that are really beneficial? I also think that the sort of polarization that we have is we have lost touch with what I would say Enlightenment liberal principles and ideals, which is really fundamentally an inquiry project, being able to be skeptical sort of as that mindset. So to me, those sort of larger inquiry skills are super, super important. And PBL is one way to do that. Inquiry is important in that. So I'm curious how you all think, especially maybe Cindy and Andrew, as you're more rooted in that research piece, is the likelihood or what your thoughts are on sort of the transferability of those kind of larger macro inquiry skills.
I'm letting you talk if you want to, Andrew.
If you have a handy answer, you should go first. I can cobble one together, or
you got it.
You.
So, this is a research-based answer, but not necessarily, do we have that research, right?
Yeah.
But from what we know about transfer of skills, you're right, they tend to be domain specific. But we tend to see that folks can transfer better when they have this encoding variability. So that is if this is ingrained in the culture, right? It's not something that they do in their civics class, but it's something that they do across the school. It is something that they're just embedded, that they just see problems and this is how we approach problems.
Mm-hmm.
Then they're much more likely to approach other problems that way as well when they approach novel problems. I'm sorry. And that's true for knowledge transfer as well, right? We know that. And this is something that I advocate for a lot when I'm talking about science of learning stuff, that if we want students to leave middle school and go to high school and practice retrieval on their own, they need to see that this is just how learning happens, right? So they need to have it embedded in everything that they do. And so I think that there is research to support that if this became sort of like a cultural thing, that this is how I approach problems, that there's reasonable evidence to say that they would be able to transfer that. Now, the problem is that would they treat school then as a domain? And transferring outside of school becomes the question. But frankly, even if I could get them to transfer those skills from high school to college, I'd be happy.
Andrew?
I'm tempted to try and change the subject a little bit, but I don't want to change it away if we should dwell here.
No, go ahead.
You've talked about tribalism a couple of times, which is, I think, a really important point to think about. And certainly I do know folks whose opinions I agree with for the most part, who can be more zealous advocates than I myself would be for those points.
I think I've met some of those folks.
It's possible you have. It's, I think, fair to say that that's true on both sides of this debate. The reason I've been looking down at my phone is I was trying to find a quotation. This is someone who I think is a pretty well-known PBL advocate. his summary of science of learning, and this is a direct quotation: "The best way to teach students is for them to shut up so teachers can tell them all the stuff that they need to know to become experts." So I responded by asking if he knew a single person who advocated that position. So I think there are ferocious claims on both sides. So the place I want to go with this is my ultimate interest. I'm going to go out on a limb and guess all of our ultimate. We want our kids to learn the things. We want them to learn the things and be good at thinking about the things. So if my perspective is correct and Cindy's is wrong, it's ultimately my goal to help Cindy change her mind. And I suspect if I say to Cindy, your position is that the best way is to tell students to shut up like that. If I say that, that's not going to help her change her mind. I'm guessing. So what I think all of us might be looking for are conversational habits that we can get into when we're having these conversations. So even though alarmingly, all four of us have embraced the idea of nuance, but when we're talking with people who aren't there, how do we find ways to talk about strong disagreements other than my telling Cindy, you're just wrong, lady, and having it devolve into extreme caricatures of positions? How do we have those conversations? How do we encourage others to have those conversations?
I have a blog out there somewhere on how to talk to teachers about learning styles, because when we started, 9 years ago, it was very much like, oh, those silly people thinking about learning. And it turns out that's not the way to change anyone's mind about anything ever. We can go into the science of learning here. So it turns out we can't erase neurons. I mean, limited research on that, but that's like kind of science fiction at this point. We can't just erase memories. So it's not like we're just going to like suddenly magically erase someone's belief. That's not going to happen. What we can do is build on it, is take it from where they are and try to go from there, meet them where they are and say, okay, here's what is true. Here's where you are right. And now let's talk about like the subtle difference in what you're talking about here, as opposed to saying that's wrong. That's never going to be the way to change anybody's mind.
Yeah, the tribalism and the absolute thinking, right? So I get more pushback from the sort of science learning folks, and I do need a little bit trying to be sort of strategic with my language and trying to stretch your thinking, right? Provoke some response and maybe point out, is this really true, or are there some contradictions, or are you being a little bit too absolutist? But that said, I was trying to find it. I was talking with somebody, or saying I was going to talk with somebody, and somebody on the sort of inquiry end of the spectrum was telling me I shouldn't talk with them. And it's like, why would I not? Like, it just seems like an absurd thing. The irony of it, though, Andrew, is you're talking about, like, how do we do this? One of the things that I find ironic is maybe not strong enough a word. It is that some of the folks who are so absolutist in their language and posts and things like that, from the science of learning side, it feels to me, so what you're describing is an inquiry process, right? An inquiry. What we're doing here, we're having a salon. This is an inquiry, rooted kind of process. And it's like the some of the folks that to me are the most absolute on the science of learning side. And I think this is true on the other side as well. And it's maybe differently ironic on that side, is that they're so lacking in inquiry skills that they denigrate inquiry, because see what I'm saying? It's like a circular kind of firing squad kind of thing. It's the idea that they would entertain different ideas, or that there's something that they might try that's not research evidence based, is so far afield that you can't really even have that conversation with them. So to me, it's like it's more engagement with inquiry. It's more engagement with questions and curiosity, and finding in some ways those right combinations of questions that get them to go, hadn't thought of it that way. And trying not to be too absolutist or vile, as some folks I think certainly are. Well, I know we're nearing the top of the hour here, and Cindy's got to go to a meeting. Are there parting thoughts? She's much more busy than the rest of us, apparently. Are there parting shots or parting things or anything else that we should introduce on the conversation here?
I'll just say quickly, a moment ago, Cindy said that you had a blog post on learning styles. I just want to point out for people who don't know the blog that Cindy writes, Cindy's blog has a blog post on practically everything that's useful. So if you have a question, run, don't walk to Cindy's blog. And she and her team are so thoughtful and do such a good job. It is a resource of infinite usefulnme
And I'll
Drew,
second
I think Drew, I think you and I should write a nuanced post about inquiry-based learning. How's that?
Hey, I'm absolutely 100% for it. Be careful what you wish for. They're an association. What is it? Guilty by association.
It'll be nuanced. I think my sort of like parting thoughts, my kind of takeaway from all of this is it's much of what I'm seeing in just the world right now, which is like there might be errors in thinking, there might be limited research, there might be limitations in many different ways, but we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. That our goals are very aligned, right? Like we all want the same outcomes here. That's what you said, Andrew. Like fundamentally, we're all working so hard in this space and are so passionate in this space because we want the same things, that if we could just sit down and have more conversations like this to find that middle ground, to talk about what research still needs to be done. Just because it's not there doesn't mean that it can't be. Right. And kind of come together. I think the world would be a better place.
Fox?
I think building directly off of that, as complex as it is when you really try to, with a range of outcomes that we believe in, and leaning into and consulting the research to bring all of it together in a way that works for the students in our system. It's a complex thing, but it is something that can be figured out and can be figured out collectively. And then those spaces really can be navigated to go to a better spot than where we've been. But it takes, I think, rapport, it takes good faith conversation, and it takes a lot of smarts and skill. Those things can be cultivated, and we have sort of a charge to make that happen.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, Cindy, that you mentioned is, and Andrew, you as well, is that, like, we all have the same goals, and I don't know if that's exactly right. I'm sort of thinking about Monica Guzman, who works with Braver Angels in the sort of polarization space, and one of the things that she said, or some version of what she said, I may butcher it here, is that we basically, almost all of us have very similar values, but we prioritize them a little bit differently. And therein lies some of the biggest arguments, right? And the narcissism of small differences or something like that, right? I think I advocate for inquiry because I value some of those inquiry skills differently, in that sort of ranking, whereas some folks are much more about knowledge, which is fine. And it's all part of that, recognizing that we have more similarities than differences, but the values, I think, are what we prioritize, I think, is really, really important to recognize. And then it's okay that somebody actually prioritizes something a little bit different. That doesn't mean they're a bad person or a menace, although there I am again. So anyways, we will put links in the show notes to Andrew's blog site. And Cindy, I don't think I've actually seen your blog site. Now I have to go look. Fox doesn't have a blog site, but the Kentucky Department of Education, they're doing great work. Yeah, we got to have more conversations like this, and it's really hard to have the conversations, hard to set them up, but I appreciate all of you for being a part of it. And as I always say, hopefully it's helpful.
Great. Thanks for organizing this, Drew.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to meet you both.
Yeah, agreed.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.